The man who slapped me at my own wedding reception was arrested 3 months later. His firm collapsed. His freedom disappeared. And I watched both happen from the kitchen table of a life I had built from nothing, with cold coffee beside me and my husband's hand in mine. I thought that was the ending. I was wrong. Because the moment Derek was removed from that ballroom, the moment Suan crossed the room and said those 6 quiet words that made Derek go pale, someone else was already watching. From above. From a closed mezzanine balcony that wasn't supposed to have anyone in it. Someone who had not been invited to my wedding and came anyway. Someone who smiled beautifully, spoke perfectly, and was more dangerous in a single lunch than Derek had ever been in 4 years. I thought surviving an ex who couldn't let go was the hardest thing I would face. I had no idea what was coming next. Before we get into it, I need to know where in the world you are watching this from right now. Drop your city and your country in the comments below, whether it is midnight in Lagos, morning in London, or afternoon in Seoul. Tell me. This community spans every corner of the globe, and I love knowing exactly where you are tuning in from. And if you have not subscribed to this channel yet, please do it right now and turn on your notifications. You do not want to miss a single story. Now stay with me, because this one does not let up from the very first line. Some stories don't end when the music stops. Some stories are just getting started. You watched Derek get walked out of my wedding reception by men who didn't need to raise their voices. You watched Suan set down his champagne glass and cross that ballroom like the room itself made way for him. You thought it was over. I thought it was over. We were both wrong. Because the night Derek learned who my husband was, that was just the opening move. What came after was a game I never saw coming, played by someone far more dangerous than a drunk ex-boyfriend in a wrinkled blazer. Someone elegant, someone patient, someone who had been watching long before I ever walked into this family. This is part 2, and I promise you it hits harder. The morning after my wedding, I was alone in the hotel's suite bathroom. Suan was on a call in the next room, speaking in low Korean, the kind of tone that meant business and not congratulations. I stood in front of the mirror in my robe, still wearing the jade bracelet his mother had placed on my wrist the night before. The mark on my cheek from Derek's hand was fading. The ringing in my ears from the ballroom was gone. But something else had replaced it, a quiet that felt less like peace and more like the pause before a second wave hits. I splashed cold water on my face and told myself to breathe. Then my phone buzzed on the marble counter. A message from a number I didn't recognize. No words, just a photograph. I picked it up and stared at the screen. The photo had been taken inside the ballroom during our first dance. I could see myself in the background, my head resting lightly on Suan's shoulder, the chandelier blazing above us like a sky full of suspended stars. It was a beautiful photo, but that wasn't why my stomach dropped. The angle was wrong. It hadn't been taken from the guest floor level. It had been taken from slightly above, from the mezzanine balcony that overlooked the reception space. A balcony that had been closed off for the entire evening. Someone had been up there watching us, not a guest, not a photographer, someone who had no business being in that space at all. The timestamp read 9:47 p.m., right in the middle of our first dance. I walked out of the bathroom and held the phone out to Suan without a word. He looked at the photo. His jaw tightened in that small, controlled way I had already learned to read like a language. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something I had not expected. "We need to talk about my sister." I set the phone down slowly on the bed. "You have a sister." He sat down across from me, and the real story began. I had spent months learning who Suan Park was. I had read articles, court filings, business journals. I had asked him hard questions across a small breakfast table and listened to answers that were honest in the way complicated things are honest, fully true and still incomplete. I thought I knew the shape of his world. I did not know about Mina. He told me her name first. Mina Park, 4 years older than him, London educated, currently operating as the administrative director of the holding company that legally oversaw 2 of his hotel chains. "She manages it," he said, "has for years." "When did you last speak to her?" I asked. 14 months ago. I waited. The falling out was about the company structure. I took back full operational control after I recovered from the accident. She disagreed with how I did it. He said it evenly, too evenly. Is that the whole reason? I asked. He looked at me. No, but it's where it started. Ray knocked at the door before I could press further. He came in carrying a printed file without being asked. The way Ray always did things, quietly and completely, as though he had prepared for every question before it was spoken. He placed it on the bed beside me. Mina Park, 8 pages. Photographs, business profiles, social event coverage from Seoul. The woman in those photographs was striking, impeccably dressed in every single image, always slightly apart from the crowd around her, always watching the room with the precise and measuring stillness of someone who was never just attending anything. She was always studying it. I read to the end of the file, then I looked up at Suin. This photograph from the wedding, the balcony angle, that's her line of sight. He didn't answer immediately. Was she on the guest list? I asked. His silence was its own answer. She had not been invited. She had come anyway. She had stood on a closed mezzanine above our first dance and taken a photograph and sent it to my phone at 6 in the morning. Not as a threat, as an introduction. 3 days into our honeymoon on Jeju Island, a card arrived at the villa. Cream envelope, no return address, delivered by a hotel concierge who said only that it had been sent through the front desk. The handwriting on the front was precise and unhurried, my name, spelled correctly, in ink that didn't bleed. Inside was a single line. Congratulations on the wedding, sister. We should have lunch. Signed, Mina. The word sister was underlined. Once, lightly, the kind of mark that could mean warmth or could mean something entirely different depending on the person who made it. I read it twice and decided it meant something different. I called Lisa. She had been staying at our city apartment under Suin's security arrangement since the night she arrived at the airport with a police report and a swollen eye. She picked up on the second ring. I need you to think, I said. Did Derek ever mention the name Mina Park? Lisa went quiet, not the quiet of someone who didn't know. The quiet of someone reaching back into a memory they hadn't examined in a while. Once, she said slowly, maybe twice. The second time it was a few weeks before the wedding. He came home and he looked scared, Naomi. I hadn't seen him scared before. He said, "We poked the wrong family." I thought he meant Suin. He didn't mean Suin, I said. No, Lisa said softly. I don't think he did. I sat with that for a long time after we hung up. The ocean was visible from the villa window, wide and pale green under the afternoon sun. Ray was in the guest house 20 meters away. Suin was on the terrace, his back to the sunrise, phone to his ear. I had married into something larger than I fully understood. I had known that from the beginning, but I was starting to understand that the most dangerous part of it had nothing to do with boardrooms or federal investigations. It was a family, and families had their own rules. I picked up the card again, sister. I decided I would go to lunch. Before lunch, I needed to understand what Derek had actually known. I flew back 2 days early, not out of fear, but out of the quiet certainty that waiting was the same as giving someone else the first move. Suin understood without me having to explain it. Lisa and I sat at the kitchen table the morning I got back, a recorder between us, 2 mugs of tea going cold. I asked her to close her eyes and go back through everything Derek had ever said about Mina Park, about the acquisition, about the Park family. She talked for 40 minutes. I didn't interrupt once. Derek had mentioned Mina by name in 2 separate conversations. The first was early in the acquisition process, when the Alderton team kept hitting walls they couldn't explain. He had said, "There's someone above the Park lawyers who we haven't been able to identify, and that person is burning every bridge we lay down." He had sounded frustrated and slightly confused, like a man who expected the game to have rules he recognized. The second time was 3 weeks before the wedding. He had come home pale and quiet. He had said, "We poked the wrong family." Then he had gone into the bedroom and shut the door, and Lisa had not asked him about it, because by then she was already learning that certain questions came with costs. I stopped the recorder and sat with what I had. Mina had been blocking the Alderton acquisition for months. Not Suan's legal team, her. She had been quietly and efficiently destroying every approach Alderton Capital made, from inside the park structure, from a position nobody on the outside knew to look for. That evening, I told Suan what Lisa had said. He listened to the recording without expression. She was protecting the company, he said when it ended. Yes, I said, but not for you. He looked at me. She was protecting it because she considers it hers. He was quiet for a long time, then very quietly, I know. The restaurant Mina chose had no prices on the menu. I noted that immediately, the kind of place designed to make certain people feel completely at ease and everyone else feel the gap between them. I arrived exactly on time. Mina was already seated, spine straight, one hand resting on the table, the other turning the stem of a water glass slowly between two fingers. She was wearing pale gray. She looked like someone who had decided exactly how this afternoon would go. She stood to greet me with a kiss on each cheek, and as she pulled back, she looked directly into my eyes and said, "You're even more beautiful in person." Suan always did have interesting taste. The word interesting sat in the air for just a half-second too long before she smiled and gestured for me to sit. Over the next 90 minutes, Mina Park was extraordinary company. She asked thoughtful questions about my work at the hotel. She laughed at the right moments. She mentioned Seoul, London, a gallery opening she had attended the previous autumn. She was warm, attentive, and completely impossible to read. I counted 7 things she said that were not quite compliments. For someone with your background, you carry yourself remarkably well. It must have been a big adjustment, stepping into Suan's world. He's always admired people who are grounded. Small needles, placed with precision, inside sentences that smiled at you while they pressed in. I didn't flinch at one. I answered everything simply, directly, and moved on. When we parted outside on the street, she tilted her head slightly and said, "I think we're going to understand each other very well, Naomi." I got into the car and called Suan. "She's not testing whether I'm good enough for you," I said. "She's deciding whether I'm a threat." A pause, and, "I think I just passed the first test," I said, "which means she's going to move to a different strategy." He was quiet for a moment. "You're right," he said. "I'm sorry." "Don't be," I said. "Just make sure your lawyers are paying attention." 8 days after the lunch, Suan's lead attorney called an emergency meeting. We sat around the conference table at 8 in the morning. Suan, the attorney, 2 associates, and me. The attorney placed a document in the center of the table. A legal motion had been filed against the Park Holding Company, filed by the administrative arm of the company itself, the arm Mina controlled. The motion challenged Suan's right to cooperate with federal investigators without board-level approval. It cited a specific clause in the company charter. It was technically valid, carefully worded, and designed to slow everything down without looking aggressive. The attorney walked us through it. Suan listened with his hands flat on the table. I read through the document quietly while she talked. On page 4, I stopped. I read the clause twice, then I looked up. "This clause only applies to decisions made before the fiscal year closes," I said. "What is the filing date on this motion?" The attorney looked at the cover page. "The 14th. "The fiscal year closed on the 11th, I said. "The filing is 3 days past the window. The clause doesn't apply." The room went still. One of the associates pulled up the company charter on his laptop. He read. He looked at the attorney. She was already reaching for her pen. "She's right," he said quietly. The motion collapsed within 48 hours. The attorney filed a response that was brief, precise, and absolute. The challenge was withdrawn without a public statement. I found out later from Ray that Mina had been informed it was me who caught the error. He told me without expression, the way he always delivered information, clean and complete. I asked how she responded. "She didn't," he said. "She just thanked the person who told her, and then she made a phone call." That was the moment I understood that I had not neutralized Mina. I had introduced myself to her properly, and now she knew exactly what she was dealing with. Suan's mother called from Seoul. I was in the kitchen when the call came through, and I watched him through the glass door of his office for the full 40 minutes it lasted. He stood for part of it. He sat for part of it. His face shifted in the small ways I had learned to read, the tightening around the eyes that meant he was being asked something difficult, the brief stillness that meant he was choosing his words. When he came out, he set his phone on the counter and said, "My mother wants to host a family dinner. In Seoul. Mina will be there." "When?" I asked. "2 weeks. "I'll be there," I said. That evening, my phone buzzed with a message from Mrs. Park directly to me, through the translation app we had been using since she extended her stay. She typed slowly, as she always did, choosing words with great care. "My daughter is not cruel. She is frightened. Frightened people do cruel things. Please do not forget this." I read it 3 times. It was the most honest thing anyone in this family had said to me that wasn't Suin. I typed back, "I won't forget it, but I also won't pretend it isn't happening." 3 minutes passed, then her reply came. "Good, neither will I." I put the phone face down and stared at the ceiling for a long moment. Mrs. Park was not choosing between her children the way I had expected her to. She was doing something harder and rarer. She was choosing to see everything clearly, her son, her daughter, and me, and refusing to look away from any of it. I thought about that for a long time, and somewhere in the thinking, the dinner stopped feeling like something to survive and started feeling like something worth showing up to fully. The Park family home in Seoul was a house that had been lived in for a long time. It had the particular quiet of a place that had held both joy and grief in its walls and was used to both. Mrs. Park met us at the door. She looked at my wrist immediately, the jade bracelet, and something in her face settled. Mina was already inside. She wore deep navy and stood near the window with a glass of water, and when I entered, she smiled and crossed the room and greeted me like a woman who had decided, for this evening, to be gracious. Dinner was formally set. The food was extraordinary. Mina managed the table the way she managed everything, precisely, warmly on the surface, always slightly in control of the temperature of the room. Twice, she redirected conversation away from something I had said, not rudely, so smoothly that anyone who didn't know her wouldn't notice. I noticed both times and said nothing. Then Mrs. Park set down her chopsticks and looked at me directly and asked, in careful English, "Naomi, tell us how you and Suin met." The table shifted. Mina's hand stilled slightly on her glass. I told the story simply and honestly, the way it had actually happened. The hotel events. The conversations that ran longer than they should have. The morning I looked Suin up online and came back anyway. When I finished, the table was quiet. Mina lifted her wine glass, took a precise sip, and said, "How charming, a hotel employee." The words landed cleanly in the silence. Mrs. Park set down her chopsticks. The sound was very small. It was barely a sound at all, but the room heard it completely. She spoke to Mina in Korean. I didn't understand the words, but I didn't need to. The tone was unmistakable, the voice of a woman who had decided something and was saying it out loud for the first time in a long time. Mina's composure cracked, not completely, just at the edges, just enough. On the flight home, I asked Suin what his mother had said. He was quiet for a moment. She told Mina she was embarrassing the family, and she said something about the bracelet. "What about it?" She said it was given with intention, and that Mina knew exactly what that meant. I looked down at the jade on my wrist, cool and smooth, the color of deep water. The next morning, I asked Ray the question I had been holding for weeks. What really happened between Suin and Mina? Not the business version, the real one. Ray stood very still for a moment. In all the months I had known him, I had never seen him look uncertain. He looked uncertain now, not about whether to tell me, but about how to carry the weight of it once it was in the air between us. "After the accident," he said slowly, "Suin was not himself for nearly 2 years. He was functioning, he went to meetings, he signed papers, but he wasn't present. Not really. Mina stepped in. She ran the operational decisions. She managed the staff relationships. She made calls that needed to be made." He paused. "When Suin came back, when he was himself again, he took back the company. Fully, without a formal conversation about what Mina had done or what it had cost her. He just resumed. I sat with that. And nobody acknowledged her, I said quietly. No, Ray said. Nobody did. I thought about Mina at that dinner table, the precision of her anger, the way she had said hotel employee like she was nomming something small and disposable. I thought about how long a person could carry unacknowledged work before it curdled into something harder and sharper. I wasn't on her side. What she had done was real, and the damage was real. But I understood something now that I hadn't before, and understanding changed the shape of what came next. 3 weeks after the dinner, a financial journalist published a piece online, not about Derek, not about Graham, about Suan. It dredged up the closed federal investigation from 7 years earlier and reframed it around a decade-old acquisition in Macau, describing it in language that was technically careful and deliberately damaging. It quoted a source close to the Park family. By the time Suan saw it over breakfast, it had already been shared across 3 industry forums. The hotel licensing renewal was 11 days away. The timing was not an accident. Suan read it with no visible reaction. I watched him. Mina, I said. He didn't confirm it. He said, the licensing board will see it before the renewal meeting. Then we get ahead of it, I said. I want to handle the licensing board meeting. He looked at me. I know I've never been in a room like that, I said before he could speak. But I've spent 3 years being in rooms where I was supposed to stay invisible. I know exactly how those rooms work. I know what they respond to and what makes them shut down. He was quiet, the kind of quiet that wasn't uncertainty. It was him measuring something carefully. I trust you, he said, completely. Then let me prepare. I spent the next 4 days in Suan's home office. The attorney's team sent me every document connected to the Macau acquisition. I built a timeline from scratch, every decision, every approval, every public record. I found 3 things the legal team hadn't thought to compile because they weren't looking for them. I wrote my statement by hand first, then typed it, then cut every word that wasn't necessary. On the morning of the meeting, I dressed carefully, not to impress, to be taken seriously. The licensing board room was on the 14th floor of a government building, with a long table and 6 people seated behind it who had heard every kind of presentation and were not moved by most of them. I had planned enough corporate events in rooms like this to know the particular energy they carried, the way they waited for you to flinch. I didn't flinch. I stood and spoke for 11 minutes. I walked them through the timeline I had built, clear, factual, in plain language that didn't ask them to trust me, just asked them to follow the evidence. I named every approval, every public record, every point where the journalist's piece had made an implication that the actual documents contradicted. Then a board member, a woman at the far end of the table, gray-haired, who hadn't changed her expression once in 11 minutes, asked about the original investigation. The investigation was closed, I said. Not delayed, not paused, closed, because the evidence did not support a charge. The article's source has a direct financial interest in this license being denied. I think this board deserves to know that before the vote. The room was quiet for a moment. Can you document that interest? The woman asked. My attorney will file the supporting documentation by end of business today, I said. The license was renewed by 5 votes to 1. In the car afterward, Suan sat beside me and said nothing for a long time. The city moved past the windows. Where did that come from? He said finally. 3 years of making other people's events perfect in rooms where nobody knew my name, I said. He took my hand and held it without speaking, and that was enough. That evening, Ray informed me that someone had photographed me leaving the board building and sent the image to Mina within the hour. What did she do when she saw it? I asked. She put her phone down, Ray said, and made a call. 2 days later, Lisa called me at 6 in the morning. That hour from Lisa meant only one thing. I picked up immediately. There's something on a Korean business forum, she said. It's about you. It's bad, Naomi. I got out of bed and opened my laptop at the kitchen table. The post had gone up at midnight. It claimed that Naomi Park, formerly Naomi Carter, had been dismissed from the Meridian Grand Hotel for misappropriating funds from private client event budgets. It included a termination letter that carried the hotel's logo, the correct formatting, a reference number, and a signature from the HR department. It looked almost completely real. By 6 in the morning, it had been screenshotted and shared over 1,000 times across 3 platforms. I read the post twice. I looked at the letter carefully. Then I set my laptop down and sat very still. My hands were not shaking. She wanted me to panic, I said to Lisa, who was still on the line. Naomi, 1,000 people have already. She wanted me to call Suen in a panic, or call a lawyer in a panic, or post a public denial in a panic, I said. Any of those things keeps the story alive for another 24 hours. So what are you going to do? Lisa asked. I'm going to make one call, I said, and this will be over by noon. Her name was Claire Nguyen. She had managed hospitality events at the Meridian Grand for 27 years. She had trained me during my first month, corrected me firmly and fairly, and once told me, during a particularly brutal event week, that I was the most detail-oriented coordinator she had ever supervised. She had meant it as the highest compliment she knew how to give. I called her at 7 in the morning. She answered on the second ring. I didn't tell her the whole story. I gave her exactly what she needed. Someone has published a forged termination letter using the hotel's letterhead and your department's format. I need a formal statement confirming my employment record, and I need to know if you'll put your name on it publicly. 3 seconds of silence. Send me the link, she said. I sent it. I waited. 40 seconds later. This is garbage. Tell me where to send the statement. The statement Claire sent was 4 paragraphs. She described my employment record with specific precision, client commendation records, budget management across more than 300 events, 2 internal promotion recommendations, 0 performance issues. The final sentence read, "The document currently in circulation is a forgery. I am prepared to confirm this in any legal setting required." Suen's legal team had a defamation filing prepared within 2 hours. The platforms received removal requests by 9 in the morning. The post was down before noon. By evening, the team had traced the post's origin through 3 separate proxy accounts to a device registered at an address in Central Seoul. Ray recognized the address before the investigator finished reading it aloud. It was registered to an assistant inside Mina's holding company. She used someone disposable, I said. Yes, Ray said. Which means she expected to be traced. She had built in the distance deliberately. She had calculated the exposure and decided it was acceptable. That told me something important. This hadn't been a last resort. It was just a move that hadn't worked, and she was already thinking about the next one. Mina called Suen directly that evening. Not her lawyers, not through a third party. Her, personally, on his direct number. He told me before he picked up. Then he put it on speaker and set the phone on the table between us and looked at me while Mina's voice filled the room. She was composed, completely. Perfectly composed, the kind of composure that was itself a performance. She said the assistant had acted without her knowledge or authorization. She said she was deeply sorry for the distress caused to me personally. She said she had been struggling with difficult emotions since the wedding and had not handled things well. She said she wanted to meet, all 3 of them, together, to find a way forward as a family. Her voice was warm and measured and full of exactly the right amount of vulnerability. When the call ended, I spoke first. She knows the trace reached her office. She's controlling the story before it reaches your legal team. That's what I heard, Suen said. She also said, as a family. She's never used that word about me before. No, he said, she hasn't. We agreed to the meeting. 3 of us, neutral location, no lawyers in the room. That night after Suen was asleep, I sat at the kitchen table with a pen and a legal pad and wrote down everything I knew. Not a list of grievances, a structure, a timeline, every piece I had laid out in order. Because for the first time since Mina's name had entered my life, I wasn't playing defense anymore. I had found something in those documents that she didn't know I had found, and I was going to walk into that meeting carrying it quietly, not in my hands where everyone could see it, but close to my chest, where it stayed warm. Lisa had been going back through the USB recordings on her own, not for the federal case. She had been going back through them the way a person returns to a place where something felt wrong, trying to identify exactly what it was. She called me on a Tuesday night, late, with her laptop open and her voice careful. "There's a conversation in the Alderton recordings that the federal team flagged as irrelevant," she said. "Derek is talking to one of the senior partners about the park acquisition stalling, and he says Mina Park directly. He says their contact at the park holding company confirmed that the internal charity fund transfers don't run through Suan's oversight. They run through Mina's direct approval." I was very still. "Charity fund," I said. "That's what he called it." I got up and went to Suan's home office. I pulled the licensing board financial disclosure from the folder where I had filed it after the renewal meeting. I flipped to the supplementary financial schedule on page 9. There it was, listed as an operational reserve fund, not a charity fund, approved annually, with a signatory line that carried Suan's name. "Lisa," I said quietly, "when was the fund established?" I heard her clicking through the recording timestamps. "Derek mentions it in the context of a 2021 filing, so it predates that." I stared at the page. The fund had a balance that was not small, and it was listed in a category that didn't require the full board's quarterly review. "This isn't a charity fund," I said, "and this isn't an operational reserve." I knew what it was. I just needed to prove it. I did not go to Suan. Not yet. Not until I was certain, because bringing him something incomplete would only give him a decision to make before he had all the information, and that wasn't fair to him or to the truth of what I had found. I went to the attorney alone. I called her at 8 in the morning and asked for a private consultation, and she gave me one at 10 without asking why. She had learned, over the past months, that when I asked for time, it was worth giving. I sat across from her and laid it out. The Alderton recording, the fund listing, the signatory line, the balance, the date range. She listened without moving. When I finished, she took her glasses off and set them on the desk. "If this is structured the way you're describing," she said carefully, "it's been running for at least 4 years. "How do I confirm it without alerting her?" I asked. She looked at me for a long moment. "You're remarkably calm," she said, "for someone describing potential embezzlement inside their own family structure." "I've been calm in rooms where I was supposed to be invisible for a long time," I said. "I've learned to use it." She opened her laptop and made 3 calls over the next hour, each one brief, each to someone who clearly knew exactly what she needed. I sat and waited. By the end of the afternoon, the fund had been fully mapped. $11 million in redirected operational reserves, 4 years of transfers, and on every single authorization document, Suan's electronic signature, a signature he had not placed there. The meeting was in a private dining room at a hotel that none of us owned. Mina arrived first, of course she did. She was in ivory this time, seated with her hands folded on the table, and she stood when we entered and greeted Suan with a brief embrace, and me with both hands clasping mine warmly. "Thank you for coming," she said, and she meant it in a way that was real and a way that was strategy, and both were true at the same time. For 30 minutes, Mina was extraordinary. She spoke about grief, about the years after the accident when she had watched Suan disappear into himself and had taken over the company not from ambition but from terror, the terror of watching everything collapse. She spoke about it with real emotion, the kind that doesn't need to be performed because it doesn't need to be. She spoke about fear, about feeling replaced when Suan returned, about making decisions she couldn't explain cleanly anymore. She was honest in the way people are honest when they believe honesty is the best remaining move. At one point, she reached across the table and touched my hand and said, "I want to be your family, Naomi. I mean that." And the strange thing was, part of her did mean it. I let her finish. I let every word land where it was placed. And then I said very quietly, "I believe some of that is true." She smiled. "But I'd like to talk about the operational reserve fund," I said. The smile did not disappear. It froze at exactly the shape it was, like a photograph of warmth, rather than the thing itself. Suin opened the folder on the table beside him. He slid one page across to Mina. It was the fund authorization document. It had his signature at the bottom. Mina looked at it for a long time. The silence lasted nearly 30 seconds. I watched Mina look at the document the way you watch someone calculate, not the answer to the question, but which version of the answer costs the least. That authorization is legitimate, she said finally. You approved that fund in 2021. Suin's voice was completely level. I was in Jeju Island in 2021. My travel records, phone records, and hotel security logs place me there on the date of that authorization. I was not in Seoul. I did not sign that document. Another silence, longer. There are people inside the holding company who have been covering for this for years, Suin continued. Some of them have already spoken to my attorney. I watched Mina process this. She was controlled, genuinely, impressively controlled, but there were small things that couldn't be managed. The stillness of her hands was too deliberate. The line of her jaw had tightened slightly. Then she looked at me, not the way she had looked at me across that lunch table, not measuring, not calculating. This was different. This was the look of a person who finally understood what they were sitting across from. You did this, she said, not as an accusation, almost with a reluctant recognition, one person acknowledging another. I found it, I said. You left the door open. She held my eyes for a moment. Then she looked at Suin, and something in her face shifted, a softness underneath the control that I hadn't seen before. She stood. She smoothed her jacket with both hands. She picked up her bag. At the door, she stopped. She spoke to the room, not to either of us specifically, and her voice was quieter than it had been all afternoon. I started the fund the year after the accident. Suin wasn't functional. The company was bleeding. I held it together for 2 years while he was gone. I made payroll. I kept the staff. I managed the legal exposure. A pause. Nobody ever acknowledged that, not once. She walked out. The door closed behind her with barely a sound. The room was very quiet after she left. I didn't speak. I let Suin sit with what his sister had said, because some things need to settle before they can be responded to properly. He sat with his hands on the table and his eyes on the middle distance, and I watched him absorb it the way a person absorbs something they have probably known, somewhere underneath everything, for a long time. On the way home, he said, she's not wrong that she held things together. No, I said, she's not. She's wrong about what it entitled her to. Yes, I said, both things are true. That evening, the attorney called at 9. Her voice was steady, but something underneath it had changed. A new file has surfaced in the discovery documents, she said. It's not Mina. It's someone who appears in the Alderton case, in the fund structure, and in an acquisition dispute from 7 years ago. Someone who has been operating in the background of all of it. Who? I asked. His name is James Wu, she said. James Wu was not someone from my past. He had never said my name in a hallway or appeared in a photograph I recognized. He was quieter than that and more dangerous. A private equity broker who moved around the edges of wealthy family structures, identified the fractures inside them, and applied pressure from both sides while standing far enough back that neither side knew he was there. The attorney laid it out for us the following morning. Wu had approached Mina 4 years ago, during the worst of the grief years. He had introduced himself as a financial consultant, charming, knowledgeable, full of practical solutions. The reserve fund had been his suggestion, framed as a smart and low-visibility operational buffer that would give Mina the flexibility to manage the company without justifying every decision to a board that barely met. She had believed him because she was exhausted and unacknowledged, and someone was finally seeing what she carried. 3 years later, Wu had used his knowledge of the Park family structure to feed Derek's firm at Alderton Capital exactly the intelligence they needed to target Suin's properties. He had kept both operations entirely separate. Neither Derek nor Mina had known about the other. He didn't want Suin destroyed, the attorney said. He wanted Suin weakened enough to need outside capital. Wu's firm was positioned to provide it, on terms that would have given him significant influence over the entire Park holdings. So Derek and Mina were both being used, I said. By someone who had been invested in this family fracturing for nearly a decade, she said. How long do we have? Suan asked. Wu has just moved to purchase a competitor hotel chain. The acquisition closes in 11 days. I went to Mina alone. No lawyers, no Suan, no Ray in a car outside. Just me at the door of her apartment at 8 on a Saturday morning. She opened the door in a robe. Without the precision of her usual presentation, she looked tired, and something I hadn't seen on her face before, uncertain. She looked at me for a moment, then stepped back to let me in. Her apartment was immaculate, but quiet. The quiet of someone who had lived alone for a long time. She made tea without asking if I wanted any. I sat at her kitchen table and waited. I told her everything about James Wu. I told it simply, in plain order, without anger or performance. The approach, the fund suggestion, the way he had used her exhaustion and her legitimate grievance as tools, the way he had simultaneously fed information to Derek's firm, keeping both operations moving without either side knowing about the other. She listened with both hands around her cup and her eyes on the table. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. If I cooperate formally, the embezzlement charges. Speak to the attorney directly about the specifics, I said. But your cooperation regarding Wu changes the picture significantly. She nodded slowly, then she looked up at me. Why did you come yourself? Why not Suan? Why not a lawyer? Because I think you needed to hear this from someone who had no reason to protect you, and chose to come anyway. She looked at me for a long time. Then she looked down at her cup. That afternoon, she called Suan for the first time in 14 months. The call lasted 2 hours. When Suan came back in, his eyes were red at the edges. We sat together and held the weight of it without trying to make it lighter than it was. Mina's cooperation unlocked a financial paper trail that Wu had spent a decade carefully building in the dark. The attorney described it as the kind of structure that only survives as long as nobody knows to look for it. We had 9 days left before the acquisition closed. On day 6, Wu discovered the investigation had reached him. His response was immediate. He accelerated the acquisition timeline and simultaneously filed a lawsuit against the Park Holding Company, claiming breach of a private consulting agreement he said predated the current investigation by 3 years. It created 48 hours of genuine chaos. On day 8, I asked to see the consulting agreement. I read it 3 times at the kitchen table with a pen in my hand. Then I turned to page 2 and looked at the date. I looked at the document format. I looked at the paper specification listed in the metadata the attorney's office had pulled. This agreement is backdated, I said. The listed date is 2019, but the paper stock specification in the metadata matches a format that the company's document management system didn't adopt until 2022. I knew document format specifications. I had managed vendor contracts for hundreds of events. I had spent 3 years catching exactly these kinds of inconsistencies in supplier paperwork before they became expensive problems. The backdating discovery collapsed Wu's lawsuit completely within 24 hours. Without the lawsuit, there was no legal mechanism to protect the acquisition. The closing was blocked by an emergency injunction on day 10. The acquisition never closed. James Wu was arrested on a Thursday morning. I was at the kitchen table when the news came through on my phone. The same spot where I had watched Derek's arrest on the same screen, with the same cold coffee beside me. The city was already busy outside. The morning looked like any other morning. The feeling this time was different from Derek's arrest. That one had felt like release, like setting down something heavy I had been carrying so long I'd forgotten the weight of it. This felt quieter, more like the closing of something that had been open too long. Lisa messaged me 2 minutes after the news broke. Do you feel like a Mafia boss's wife yet? I laughed, a real laugh out loud alone at the kitchen table. It felt good. That afternoon, the attorney released a public statement on behalf of the Park family. It acknowledged the internal financial irregularities, confirmed full cooperation with federal authorities, and announced a restructured governance model. Mina Park was listed as a non-executive board advisor. And in the third paragraph, a line I had asked to be included and that Suan approved without hesitation. The statement formally acknowledged that between 2018 and 2020, Mina Park had provided essential operational management that stabilized the company during a critical period. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't erasure of what she had done. But it was the acknowledgement that had been owed for years before any of the rest of it happened. When I got home that evening, I found a cream envelope on the front step. The handwriting was Mina's. I recognized it from the first card she had sent to the villa, precise and unhurried, ink that didn't bleed. I took the envelope inside, sat at the kitchen table, and opened it carefully. 4 pages, handwritten on both sides of 2 sheets of cream paper, in the same handwriting but slightly looser than usual, like it had been written without stopping to revise. It began, "I owe you a truth I have not been honest enough to say in person." She wrote about the 2 years after the accident. Not as a grievance, but as a plain account. The emergency board calls at midnight, the staff she kept from resigning through sheer consistency, the legal exposure she had quietly managed without any formal authority to do so. She wrote about how it felt when Suan came back. Relief first. Then, slowly, as the weeks became months and no one said anything, a cold understanding that the 2 years she had given would simply be absorbed into the company's history without a single word of acknowledgement. She wrote about Wu, about how seen she had felt when someone finally named what she had done. She wrote, "I did not examine his motives because I did not want to. I was hungry for someone to see me, and I chose not to ask why he was looking." Near the end, she wrote, "You came to my door without a lawyer. You told me the truth without anything in your hand that could hurt me. I have been in this family for 40 years. I don't think anyone has done that for me before." The letter ended with 1 paragraph. "I don't know yet if I can be a sister to you. I have not been good at that. But I would like to find out if you are willing, not for Suan, for whatever this could be on its own." I folded the letter carefully and placed it behind the wedding photograph on the mantel. Then I picked up my phone and called Mina, not to respond to the letter, not to say anything significant, just to ask if she had eaten. She was quiet for a second. Then, "No." "Order something," I said. "The good place on the corner." "You know Seoul restaurants." "Mrs. Park has opinions," I said. Mina laughed. A small, real laugh, the first one I had heard from her that had nothing managed about it. We talked for 20 minutes about nothing important. And it was the beginning of something neither of us had a name for yet. 6 months later, Mina and I had coffee every Wednesday morning at the restaurant with no prices on the menu. We argued about things. We agreed about others. She was not easy company, and I suspected I wasn't either, and that turned out to be fine. It was real. That was enough. Derek was serving 3 years in a federal facility. He had sent 1 letter. I had not opened it. I gave it to the attorney, and that was the last of it. James Wu received 7 years. His firm dissolved before the sentencing. The hotel acquisition he had spent a decade positioning for never happened. Lisa was in her first semester of a graduate journalism program. She called every Sunday morning without fail. She was sleeping through the night. She had stopped moving carefully, the way a person moves when they're managing something painful. She moved like herself again. Claire Nguyen received a commendation at the Meridian Grand's annual staff event, formally recognizing her professional conduct during the defamation action. She sent me a photo of the plaque afterward. The message said only, "You turned out well, kid." Mrs. Park had extended her visit indefinitely. She and I cooked together on Fridays. We communicated through the translation app and hand gestures and the particular language of standing beside someone in a kitchen and learning the way they move. It was, improbably and completely, one of my favorite hours of the week. On a Thursday evening in early spring, Suan and I sat on the back terrace. The city below us, spread out in lights, the same city that had been there on the worst night and every quiet night after. He took my hand and held it without speaking for a long time. Then he said, "Do you know what I noticed about you? That first week at the hotel before I ever asked to work with you specifically." "What?" I said. You were the only person in that building who walked into every room like it mattered. Like you were already thinking about who was going to be inside it. Like other people's experience of a space was something worth caring about. I thought about that. About the woman who had worn herself down to nothing for a man who treated her like a set of adjustments to be made. About the kitchen floor after the Instagram photo. About coffee and going to work and choosing, quietly, to keep going. I was invisible then, I said. No, he said. You were unseen, that's not the same thing. Below us, the city hummed, full and ordinary and extraordinary all at once. The photograph from the wedding was on the mantel inside. That woman had always been there. She was still here. She wasn't going anywhere. If this story held you from that very first line all the way to this one, then you already know exactly why this channel exists. Stories like Naomi's. Stories about women who were underestimated, worn down and written off, and who came back in ways nobody saw coming. Stories that are gripping, human, and impossible to stop once you've started. Now I want to hear from you. What did you honestly think about this story? Drop your review in the comments, your real, honest thoughts. Did the ending surprise you? Did Mina's letter hit differently than you expected? Was there a moment that stopped you completely? Tell me everything. This community reads every single comment and your voice matters here. And while you're down there, drop your location too. Your city, your country, the time it is where you are right now. Whether you are watching this at midnight in Johannesburg, morning in Manila, or late evening in London, tell me. I love knowing exactly where in the world you are tuning in from. If you have not subscribed to this channel yet, please do it right now. Hit that subscribe button and turn on your notifications, because every single week there is a new story waiting for you. Stories with twists you won't see coming. Stories that stay with you long after the last line. You do not want to miss a single one. I will see you in the next story.